everybody, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I would like to share with you this beautiful red rose bouquet that I painted using the Graham Watercolors. Now, Graham Watercolors happen to be my absolute favorite, and when I received these beautiful, I received 24 beautiful red roses from my boyfriend for Valentine's Day as a token of his love for me, and I wanted to share them with the world, and I wanted to make sure that I could, their beauty would last forever, and now they will because I painted them. I'm going to be working in my sketchbook, my watercolor sketchbook that has Arches paper inside. I have a DIY tutorial video on my channel that I'll leave linked up if you guys are interested in learning how to make this sketchbook for yourself. But for now, let's get into the tutorial. I'll be sharing some tips along the way. Now, all the materials, as always, will be listed in the description box down below. Let's go ahead and get started. So for the background, as you can see, I started off dripping in colors wet into wet. I'm using some very traditional historical hues for this because I had a very painterly kind of romantic, just traditional look in mind. I wanted to have that really old world look and feel to it. So I'm using raw sienna, raw umber, burnt sienna, and for that sort of pinky, rosy, neutral color that you see, I was tempted to use Potter's Pink, but I wanted to stick to all of my Winsor & Newton, all my Graham watercolors for this. So I actually mixed a little bit of the permanent Alizarin Crimson into my raw umber mix, and I was able to replicate the hue pretty well, and it granulated because of the raw umber. So I dropped in some of those colors wet into wet. I went in with a napkin there, a paper towel, and I lifted out some areas. I'm not worrying about going over the roses so much because I knew that I'm using the Graham watercolors and I'm using some really strong semi-transparent to semi-opaque reds that I'd be able to cover it up, and I didn't want a halo around my image, so I wanted to make sure that I went right over top of some of it, but you know, try not to get too much of that color on the blooms themselves. Then I came in with a sponge on top to do some soft texture. Now, I didn't want the texture to be too much or overcomplicated because then I felt like it would distract too much, but I did definitely want that soft, spongy-like texture. I really felt like it gave a mottled look that helped lend to the looser, more traditional look of this painting, and I couldn't be more thrilled with how it came out. I also made kind of a gray from the raw umber and Anthraquinone Blue that I chose to use instead of ultramarine blue. It's a more subdued kind of muted blue, very smoky and dark. And I used that to add some shadows to the background, a little bit to the mottled edge. Now for the table, a lot of this, the background on the table is out of my own imagination. In reality, they were sitting on a black granite countertop in my kitchen, but for the point, I used my artistic license to make the background look more warm and kind of romantic there. I wanted to use the raw umber and burnt umber to create a nice brown kind of table. I thought that would look a lot better with the background than just, you know, painting what I saw in reality. You don't have to paint everything that you see in reality. And I came in, I got some visual weight underneath those rose petals and underneath the vase itself. I wanted to make sure I put those shadows in on the table. And I also added a little bit of that rosy color as influence onto the table as well, because, you know, that you would see that's natural. You know, there'd be some of the red color of the ribbon and of the roses reflecting on the table. Now, I wanted to mention too that before I even began, I added quite a bit of masking fluid to preserve the whites of the painting, but also you'll see a lot of what right now look like yellow dots, kind of like our dirty yellow dots all over in between the roses. That's the masking fluid, but will eventually end up being the baby's breath. So because I wanted to make it a traditional transparent watercolor, those baby's breath are going to be bright white, and that's going to be the bright white of my painting, but I won't be able to see that until the very end. So I'm already planning things out and compensating now for the bright white at the end, and I'm basing all my values around it. So now going in to begin working on some of that foliage, none of it's going to be overly detailed or sharply defined. Again, I was going for a more splashy, kind of loose look. when it came to this piece. So what I'm actually doing is I'm going to wet out that area, and I'm going to blend wet into wet, but it's going to fade right out into the background. It's going to soften out into the image so that nothing is going to be overly defined. You might see a hint of a leaf or a little bit of foliage here or there, you know, a twig, a vine, whatever, but really I want it to be pretty loose and abstract. So when I'm coming in to add color there into the darker areas, which is very important that I get my darks dark enough with this piece, I'm going to be using some of the Anthraquinone Blue into my Sap Green to make it very dark and cooler. And then actually, as I want it to get warmer and lighter, I'm going to be using raw sienna as my yellow, which is somewhat of an earth yellow, but it's really more of a yellowy brown. And by using that color instead of, there's no bright yellow in this piece, by using that to lighten my green instead of a brighter yellow, I'm keeping the color palette very neutral, very subdued, and kind of muted. And that is going to help lend to the more traditional look of this painting that I was going for. But it's also going to keep everything else besides the roses, which are obviously going to be very bright. Everything else around it we're keeping pretty neutral so that the roses will really pop and appear brighter. I'm also dropping in some coarse grind kosher salt while the paint is still wet into the foliage so I can get that really nice texture. I love using salt in my watercolor work for textural effects and special effects. It's great for things like rocks, foliage, earth, snow. It's a great technique. You've seen me use it time and time again in my watercolor tutorials, and I really recommend that technique. So there's another tip for you there. And as you can see, as I'm coming in there, I'm making sure that in between the blooms, I have a really rich, dark, saturated chromatic green. And there's varying tones of blues and greens mixing on the page there that may not be visible just yet on camera, but it'll be more noticeable later. But I really want to make sure I get that contrast in there. That's very important. Not only is that realistic to what I'm seeing in person, but also I know, like I said, I've got to plan ahead for my brightest whites. Even though they're not visible yet, they won't be till I take the masking fluid off. I need to make sure that I get that good dark contrast in now. So when I remove that masking fluid, those bright white flowers, the bright white baby's breath is really going to pop and stand out against it. If I'm afraid to push my darks now, then I'm not going to have the pop I'm looking for later. So now coming in to work on that vase, there are a lot of ways that you could approach a glass vase when you're working in a floral, but I really didn't want this to be overly detailed. I'm sorry about my head keep popping into the shot there and my frizzy hair. I really didn't want this to be overly detailed. I wanted to go for a looser, more abstract look to the vase, so in other words, you're not going to be seeing every individual stem down into that water, from the roses, but overall, you will see influences of the green and influences of blue from what the water would be. But one of the most important details to that vase is going to be that it's dark enough underneath the bow. I still have that beautiful red bow that my boyfriend gave me for Valentine's Day. But I want to make sure it's nice and dark and rich and nearly black underneath where the red bow is going to be, because I need that contrast so that the bow can stand out. You'll see me go in with a damp brush and maybe even with a paper towel in a minute to start lifting highlights out from that glass vase, because it's important that I get the shape and the dimension, because there would be reflections in there, and also there's influences that aren't going to be too obvious to the naked eye, but I did put hints of brown and reds into that vase because glass and water are reflective, and so you'd see influences of those colors in there. Now going in to start work on that bow, one of the biggest differences between the bow and the roses is color temperature. They're both red, but I noticed that the bow was a warmer red, more of that Pyrrol Red, as where the roses were going to be more crimson, cooler, more scarlet. And that was a detail that I wanted to keep for the painting. And I thought that would make it look more interesting and help break everything up a little bit. I liked that, so I kept it. Now, that's not to say that I didn't cross-pollinate those colors, that there wasn't some of that warm Pyrrol in with the roses and some of the cooler crimson in the shadows of the bow, because there was. But predominantly, I'm keeping the bow warmer and the roses a bit cooler. Now, coming into work on that tissue paper, that pink paper, it ended up looking almost cloth-like, which is what I was going for in the painting. But in person, it was actually a bright candy pink tissue paper. It was beautiful, but it wasn't the look I was going for my painting, so I changed it. I never used any of that pink watercolor on its own. I muted it down with some of the raw umber, and in the shadow areas, you know, the crinkles and the crackles and the shadows of that paper, I used a more concentrated version of that muted, earthy, kind of almost potter's pink color. Now, something that's important to keep in mind when rendering paper is that it can end up looking very flat very quickly because there's not a lot of visual weight to the paper. So I exaggerated the shadows and the crinkles that I did see in order to improve it and have it translate a little bit better to painting. Now, later on, I did come in with a lifter, a scrubber, and I lifted out some bright white highlights on that tissue paper. And I'm pretty happy with how it came out. Very soft, almost cloth-like, and it doesn't pull too much focus. So as I go in now to begin working on the flowers of that bouquet now, one thing that you'll notice is that with this style, I'm definitely not detailing every single flower. And in fact, most of them are quite loose and abstract, with the two roses in the front probably being the most detailed, but they're still quite loose here. What's important to remember with this style is that you don't have to put in a lot of detail necessarily, because when you're looking at a multi-flowered bouquet like that, it's really easy for your eyes to get lost and start to get a little bit dizzy and unsure about what they're looking at, because there was 24 roses there. So you're going to see bits and pieces. You know, you'll see petals here, petals there. Your eye will see a little bit of detail, and your brain is going to fill in the rest. So you definitely want to make sure that you are putting in some detail, of course. The details that you do choose to put in should be accurate, but the most important, I would argue, concept here is value. Having those good, strong values are going to be the most important aspect here, even more so than usual. And of course, value is always the backbone to good artwork, but I'm making sure more than ever now that I have my darks dark enough and my lights light enough so I can get good contrast to represent the image well. So you'll just see me coming in and adding a lot of glazes, a lot of layers. In most instances, when it comes to those roses, I'm trying to get my darks in first. That way I can base all the other values around it, so I'm certain that I'm getting good contrast. Now, like I had already mentioned, I'm using the Graham Watercolors for this, and I'm using quite a few reds. I actually have never used 3 reds in a painting before, but I did for this one, and I rather enjoyed it. I felt that it was called for because I wanted to have that nice warm kind of Pyrrol Red for the ribbon and that nice cool crimson in with the roses. And I'm very pleased with how this came out, but I wouldn't have chosen any other watercolors for this piece, because when I want bold, punchy colors, I'm going to go with Graham. They never disappoint me. I'm always able to get rich, saturated color with them. Their reds in particular are some of the most luscious, vibrant, beautiful reds that I've ever tried. And I love the fact that they have the honey in them. I think that helps them to have better flow, better clarity. They're just gorgeous. If I could only choose one watercolor brand, it would be Graham. But you know, I've tried a lot of things. You guys know I've tried a lot of things. I've reviewed a lot of watercolors on my channel, and there's just something extra special about the Graham. They are my favorite, which I do plan to do a review on them, like I probably already said, sometime here in the very near future. So as I begin to go in and work on the ribbon, I'm making sure that I'm careful to leave highlights where the light would be hitting that ribbon, because it's supposed to be a very shiny kind of satin ribbon there, if you will. I'm not sure that it was actually satin, but you get what I'm saying. It would be light reflective. And if you want to capture that sort of rounded appearance to the bow, especially where the ribbon kind of wraps around and fades back into the darkness, you need to make sure that it's going to be more highlighted, especially in the middle of that sort of rounded edge. You know what I'm saying? Up there in where the ribbon kind of overlaps and does all these curly, pretty things. So you want to make sure that you're getting some good dimension in there, and shape and form, and leaving those highlights according to your light source when you're painting your own paintings. One of the challenges that I found that I came across when working in this piece was that it almost, and it didn't strike me immediately. It wouldn't be till somewhere in the middle of this painting that it hit me. It was almost like working monochromatically. You know, it was challenging in the same way that working in grayscale often can be. Even though this is a colorful painting, it's a lot of red. You know, the roses are very red and the ribbon is very red. And so for those parts of the painting, it became almost a monochromatic theme and challenge in that way. So it definitely became doubly, quadruply important that I had good, strong values in there. Otherwise, it was just going to disappear into a big blob. And the painting wouldn't have taken on shape and form and begun to look somewhat realistic in the way that I wanted it to. So that was somewhat of a challenge. And also, around the 3/4 mark of this painting, it started to go through a serious ugly phase, and it just wasn't looking right. And I believe that the biggest part of what was contributing to that was the fact that my bright whites were covered up by that masking fluid, which had sort of disappeared quite a bit because the masking fluid was not only tinted, but it was being covered in layers of paint. And so I had to compensate and work around that quite a bit and imagine those highlights, imagine those whites in there, and sort of take a leap of faith and push through, knowing that it would all come together in the end. But a lot of paintings will go through an ugly phase. Don't stress out about it. Don't worry about it. A lot of the time people think, oh no, the painting is ruined, and they give up. When it's really just 3/4 of the way done, you're on the right track. It just isn't finished yet. You have to keep layering, you have to keep glazing, you have to keep adding, and eventually you'll get it to look the way that you want it to. Just don't give up, because most paintings, almost every painting I've ever worked is going to go through that ugly phase. It's okay. It's normal. Just keep working on it. This painting definitely boiled down to a lot of layers, a lot of glazes to build up that depth, that clarity, and that's really what watercolor is known for, so I was very happy to do that. Even though this is a looser style for me, this painting took a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot more work than you might think. I definitely spent a couple days, maybe nearly a week on it, because probably I don't know, I would say closer to 4 days or so I worked on this. And it's because there was, even though it was a looser style, there was still a lot of detail going into that bow and into the bouquet. There was 24 roses there. There was a lot of work that had to be put into it. So, you know, never just watch somebody's speed painting or tutorials and assume that there's something wrong with you because it's not building up as quickly as you would like. No, it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I think that's the part that a lot of the time when you're watching YouTube tutorials, you don't see, or you don't grasp just how much time, you know, in real time went into that painting. And there you can see I'd removed the masking fluid, and it was just like, bam, the whole painting came together and it just popped. And bear in mind, the only difference between that clip and the clip that came before it was simply that I removed the masking fluid, and now my lightest value, my bright whites, were now visible. So remember I told you how difficult it was sort of to imagine and envision that from the very beginning and push through that ugly phase, because I knew that was coming. That's the moment that I was really waiting for the whole time, was I knew that it would all come together, but I had to take that leap of faith. I had to really plan out and build the painting around that, because the minute that those highlights came out and the mask fluid came off, the whole painting just sparkled, and I got that moment of satisfaction that I was waiting for. Now, I didn't leave all the baby's breath completely white. I did go in and add a layer of a very soft gray that I had mixed from my blue and my brown in order to push some of those baby's breath back a little bit, and that's natural. You would see that. Some of them would be in shadow. It adds dimension and realism to the piece. I also went in with an X-Acto knife or an X-Acto blade, and I scraped out some little white sparkles and some little vines in the foliage to connect back some of the baby's breath, because you would see that detail. And I love using an X-Acto blade lately, or an X-Acto knife to carve out little sparkles toward the end. Even though I use masking fluid and I reserve things, sometimes there are little sparkles you can't always completely plan for, and that is a great way to keep your painting a traditional transparent watercolor, but carve out some of those good sparkles. But I will bear in mind, or I will give you a little cautionary note rather, not every paper can handle that. So make sure you're using a high quality paper. Otherwise, you may ruin the paper. And also make sure that you're reserving that technique for the very end to carve out those sparkles, because you are intentionally damaging the paper. And if you were to wash over that again with paint, it would be very obvious that the paper was damaged. So make sure you reserve that technique for the very end. And that pretty much wraps up today's tutorial. I want to thank, first and foremost, my love for being so generous to gift me 24 beautiful long stem red roses for Valentine's Day. And I want to thank you all so much for watching. If you found today's video helpful, I hope that you'll give me a thumbs up and consider subscribing. I'd love to have you on the channel. I'm really pleased with how this painting came out, but be sure to let me know in the comment section down below what you think, if you have any thoughts. Also, stick around for a review on the Graham Watercolors, because I think I'm going to be doing that soon. They're not a product that's new to me. I've had them for many years. And yeah, that's pretty much it. As always, I want you guys to have a great day, a blessed day, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.